Hello, everybody. How's everyone doing? How's it going, Chad?
Good, Nick. How you doing, buddy?
I'm good, man. Keeping busy. It's great to have everyone here this week. I'm just gonna get my screen up. Can everyone just give a confirmation that you can hear me as well as see my screen? I'm currently pointing at a web page. Just want to make sure all the technical details are working.
Thank you all.
Hey, awesome. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Kent. Thanks, Patrick. Thanks, Jay. Much appreciated. Great to have you guys all with us. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes and then hop into, is it week 4, Chad?
It's week 4, dude. That's crazy.
Yeah. So yeah, we're in week 4 of exploring the VFX Suite as well as workflows along with that in Cinema 4D. Last week was all about render passes. I'm going to pick that up shortly and look at depth pass, which was something we couldn't get to last week.
I'm kind of like bummed, to be honest. This is like 80% over after like in an hour. This whole thing, this month will be 80% over, and like I'm kind of sad about that a little bit. Like I feel like it's like the end of summer camp, you know?
It is, yeah. It's like we have August 24th, and even to say it's like it's gone by so fast, and we even got an extra week compared
I
to your
know.
usual month on Mondays where you only have 4. We have 5, and it still feels like we could talk about these topics for another 5 sessions and focus on each individual part of the suite and Cinema 4D. Can't
Yeah,
believe time has gone so fast, and that it's almost September 2020,
I know. That's crazy.
right? Cool. So we're just going to wait one more minute, everybody, and then we're going to get started with the content.
I have a frog in my throat, so if I mute some, I mute
I think
myself,
you,
it's because I'm drinking water or clearing my throat. It's not because I left or something. So don't panic.
Okay, I'll try not to panic and start screaming for some reason. Chad.
For the 10 seconds that I'm on mute.
Yes. Well, anyway, it's great to have everyone here. It is 12 o'clock Eastern, 9 o'clock Pacific, and thank you everyone so much for joining us for week 4 of our venture into demystifying post-production workflows for compositing in VFX Suite. And I'm joined by the fabulous expert Chad Perkins. I'm so excited
Hey,
to be here in week 4 with you.
you
And
too, buddy.
what do we have this week to cover?
Well, then we're gonna do well, the thing on your screen right there. We're gonna do post render, shadows, reflections, and depth of field. But I think we're gonna dig like really deep into this depth of field thing, which I'm pretty stoked on. Both covering it in Cinema 4D and what to do in After Effects.
Yes, yeah. So last week we actually took a look at different render pass workflows in Cinema 4D and sending files to After Effects and utilizing certain VFX Suite plugin effects. And this week we're going to pick up that same type of render pass workflow, but looking at how to set up a depth of field inside of Cinema 4D. And then Chad's going to take that and show you a few different ways that you can apply a depth of field pass using the VFX and other plugins inside of After Effects. You should note that besides this series, we have one more. Uh, Besides this week, we have one more session on faster compositing with SuperComp next week, which you can sign up for. As well as if you look at the Red Giant blog, there's a whole new set of topics for September 2020. And I believe this is going to be continued for almost every single month every single month this year. On Mondays moving forward, there'll be a topic that people will explore. So if you're up to seeing some more free content, join us in September 2020, where they'll be covering MoGraph generators, effectors, fields, and fracturing inside of Cinema 4D. Last thing to mention is that we are recording this webinar, so you could head to the YouTube page, usually a couple hours after a webinar, and be able to check out what we covered this week. So without further ado, after all that housekeeping is done, I'm going to hop inside of Cinema 4D and welcome everyone who's just tuning in. Everyone can see my screen okay? You can still see that, Chad?
I can still see it, and it looks amazing. Some flipping
Awesome.
going on.
Yeah, there's a couple things going on here. I've got a compass that is that's flipping, as well as some text that's been fractured and is moving into place. And you can see here a really simple kind of landscape background where I have several landscapes positioned in Z space to try to give off the feeling of depth. And I'm going to take this all inside of After Effects and composite it together. But essentially what I want to do before that, Chad, is identify a range that's in focus and then essentially two ranges that are outside of focus. And rather than have Cinema 4D render this using the physical renderer, I'm just going to use the standard renderer, which is going to be a lot faster, and send this to After Effects and then use plugins inside of there. So the big question is, well, how can you set something like this up? And although I have a camera in my scene, I'm actually going to just disable this so we can kind of take another look here at the world. And rather than use this camera, I'm just going to turn it off temporarily in my scene and create a new one for us to work with. Just to make sure that it is centered on my scene, I'm just going to select it and then just do a little bit of reframing here, roughly where I had my other camera set up. So not quite perfect, but this was roughly the framing that I want to end my final title in. And in order to kind of get some depth of field within the shot, in fact, I'm going to back this up a bit more. There we go. I'm going to look outside of my camera again just to show you how my camera looks and sort of the range that's being presented on this camera. So in order to do a depth pass, we have two choices, Chad, here. One's a depth of field map front blur, and the other is a depth of field map rear blur. The minute that I click on this button, did you see that there was a point here added to my camera?
Sure. Yes, I totally noticed that.
Yeah, so this little point actually is going to represent the range, okay, from out of focus to in focus. And how you establish sort of where the in focus range is going to basically completely be over, we can grab this point, making sure, okay, we can see here the start is at 0 centimeters, while the end, I'll just even drag this here for you, the circle. Let me make that 400 so I can see it again. You can see here that I've identified a range of this is where it's going to start. Everything from this point is going to be out of focus, and then it's going to gradually come into focus based on this range that I've identified. And I've sort of set up my camera here in a way. This is not.
So that's the blurry
complete.
section.
Yeah, this is the first point here is the blurry section. Okay. And this is going to be completely in focus. And in between these 2 points is going to be, you know, your
the transition
semi-in focus section.
Gotcha.
Now, one thing about this is once you've identified this range, okay, this is looking a little bit better for when it comes in frame. I'll usually go to my camera and we can do a test. Ideally, we don't want to render out this whole thing. In fact, I'm going to head over just to show you that under my output settings, I only have it set to a current frame. And what's great about this is that you essentially need to do this just for a sanity check, okay? But once you click on this button and we take a look here in the picture viewer, you could head over to single pass and then see a preview of your depth pass. Now, just not get confused, I'm actually just going to close this down temporarily. And I want to go to my mountains and just turn them off, okay? So here we're just going to look at the text. Give it a second to render. So Chad, you see that there's some areas here where the text is completely white.
Mm-hmm.
This is a good sign to say that, hey, that is going to be out of focus. Okay. This gray here is the transition. And then if your text is black, which we can't quite see on this background, that means it's going to be in focus, so to speak.
Okay.
So I identified one range here for the text, right? So when it flies in, it looks a little bit out of focus, and then we hit the range where it is in focus. And then I wanted a separate range of a depth pass specifically for my mountains in the background, okay? And how that was achieved was, again, with the camera here. I then enabled a depth pass map rear blur. Now I had the start of this kind of slightly wider than this initial 0 centimeters to have a range that's in focus. And then I took the back point here and moved it back so it's kind of across the mountains that I want to see inside of After Effects, okay, or the landscape. And this identified that second portion that was in focus. If I come back here to the camera now and just we'll do a test, we can see that there's going to be two ranges that are taking place. However, it should be noted that yeah, so one is for the text and then the other is for the mountains, and you can see that general transition. Now this is sort of a rough setup because I just set up a camera in an existing project. The great news about this is that I can actually get rid of this camera altogether right now and show you the actual camera that I ended up finishing these two depth passes with. If I just click on here to do another render, we can see these two separate ranges. Okay, so here you can see a clear right transition where right where the mountains start, this is going to be in focus. But as you gradually go off into the background, it's getting closer to white, which is going to be out of focus. And then the exact opposite is happening here for the text, right? So it starts off as white, out of focus, and then when it hits this area right here, right, the compass, that is the in focus range. So this is how flexible it is. And it took me a while to get used to this, specifically in Cinema 4D, because some of the controls here in the physical renderer cry out to be used as an After Effects artist. You've got an f-stop here, you know, where you can set your f-stop. You've also got some great controls where you can identify a range that's in focus, but then you're depending on the physical renderer. Where in the details tab here, by just simply setting this up, the map front blur, map rear blur, while you're not going to be able to see a preview with the physical renderer, you're creating a depth pass, which will save you time when you render out this file, and then that you can use inside of After Effects, right? On top of that, you've got two different ranges for your depth pass, and what I finally did for my project, and I'll go back to this a little bit later on, is I had one pass specifically for my text, and then I had another depth pass just for my mountains. And I was able to take both of those in After Effects, and by using, in my case, I just used the camera lens blur, but there are other plugins that you could use that would identify your depth pass so that you can get some great depth of field transitions. In fact, I think you were mentioning to me earlier, Chad, that you have one available, right? Or like you basically have a depth pass to show people.
Yes. Yeah. So there's a question here for you from Andreas. It's is the start of the rear blur measured from the camera begin 0 or from the end of the front blur being 0?
Could you repeat that question? So is the start, it's basically
yeah, like where is the start of the
is the
rear
in
blur?
focus. It's the start of the in focus range. So
Okay.
on each of these, the start value refers to the in focus, while the end will reveal to the out of focus range.
But so like when it says like start is 0 centimeters for the rear blur, for example, is the 0 centimeters the beginning of the camera, or is 0 centimeters the end of the front blur?
The beginning of the camera, right?
Okay.
So this is identifying the beginning of the camera. This is identifying, as you can see, as I drag it here on the front blur. And by the way, this is a fabulous question. This is going to be the out of focus area. Specifically, what I'm looking at right now happens to deal with the front blur itself. For the rear blur, I'm asking the start to be 750 centimeters away from this area.
Oh, so it
right?
is, so the rear blur is measured from the front blur.
It's measured from, it's measured from, yeah, this point right here, right? Which is 0.
Okay,
Does
gotcha,
that make
gotcha.
sense? So now it's
Yes.
750 centimeters away where the in focus range is starting, and then expanding out to this abstract number of 4,508 centimeters.
That's fantastic. That's been a question of mine. So Andreas, thank you so much for asking that, and great answer, Nick. Thank you.
Yeah. So you have those two ranges, and in my particular case, just to avoid some of the edge problems that might occur because of these backgrounds, which I'll show a little bit later today, time dependent, I rendered out the text separately and then the background separately as well by just turning them on and off. And this just gave me some maximum flexibility for final post-production steps using the VFX Suite inside of After Effects.
Awesome. Paul had a question too. Can the depth of field be changed to extremes? I'm not sure exactly what that means. Does that question make sense to you? I'm not sure what that means.
I think in terms of extremes, so with the physical renderer, if I'm hearing this right, you could actually have camera settings that don't even exist in the real world. So you could have an extreme, if you're referring to an extreme extreme blurry image, you can do that using the physical renderer, right? And
Okay.
basically taking the f-stop here.
Oh yeah, Paul says super
and making
blurry.
it something like 0.4, okay? And that then you're relying on the physical renderer to do that inside of Cinema 4D. With a depth pass, we're just identifying the range, right, that we want in focus and out of focus. So where the blurriness amount comes into play is based on the effect that you choose to create the blur in After Effects, right? So the camera lens blur has a setting for the amount of blurriness. This is just defining the transition from that blurry area to the in focus area. So basically, if you're doing it in After Effects like we are with the depth pass, the blurriness amount, the extreme blurry value, is handled in After Effects by that effect.
Yeah, and that'll probably make more sense once we actually jump into After Effects and you could actually see the depth pass and us fiddling with it and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I know that you have an example, Chad, so I'm going to hand this over to you.
Okay.
I
Oh
hope
wait, can I ask one more question? Sorry, before we go.
Oh, totally, yeah.
I feel like I've done this before with the details thing and the front and end, and I still haven't been able to get a good depth pass out of cinema, or it's not predictable for me. Is there something that you're doing in the render settings with the depth that allows you I don't know, something magical that you're doing in your render settings? Like when you click on depth on the pass, is there some kind of
Nope.
nope,
I'm using
there's no setting.
literally a standard renderer. I was amazed by this too, because I used to fool around with the physical renderer, but then when someone showed this to me, I was just like, no, I got this with the standard renderer. I think the most important step from my education, Chad, like in learning how to use the two passes, was to be just extremely explicit about the ranges, if that makes any sense. So I'm
Yeah, I
always
feel
just double checking a few different still image renderers to make sure that the depth pass looks great in terms of a transition. In some
yeah.
cases, you're manipulating the colors of that depth pass inside of After Effects
Mm-hmm.
to perfect what you're trying to achieve. Because you can do a bunch of things with it. We can, of course, make certain things like with a camera lens blur or a third-party plugin, you can identify ranges of blurriness, but you could also do things like create atmospheric effect, right? Because in the background with the mountains, I wanted to kind of give the idea of the mountains receding in the background. So I might as well just kind of show this because I'm on this part, if that's okay.
Yeah, Kent has a question too that's interesting to me. Are there any anti-aliasing issues with the depth pass?
Yes, there can be some anti-aliasing issues with the depth pass. There are multiple ways to handle it, and I want to just be honest that I'm trying to explore this topic a little bit more. Sometimes people get rid of the anti-aliasing problems by using another effect inside of After Effects. Chad, you mentioned an effect that kind of tries to solve some of the anti-aliasing that shows up. Is it called Bokeh Pro? Am
Yeah,
I
I'm gonna
correct in
go
that?
get into a few options there. It doesn't. It's not specifically meant to handle the anti-aliasing. Well, it'll make sense when we get there. I'll cover that. There also is another tool that I've used recently, specifically for anti-aliasing. It's not just for depth passes, but it's called FXAA. Have you heard of that before? It's like a little, I think it's a free script on
I
AE
haven't heard of
script.
that. No,
Yeah,
that's
it's called
cool. Okay.
FXAA, and it's like if you just have like any kind of jagged edges from a render or like from keying or just anything. There's been times where I've brought in like, vector files or whatever, and sometimes there's just weird like extra sharpness or something like that. And FXAA has been a lifesaver in just taking those like weird edges, even internal edges that aren't edges on the outside of something. And FXAA just, I don't know, it adds an extra bit of anti-aliasing internally. I've gotten really great results from that in most cases. So
Okay.
pretty sure it's free.
I know that some people use also Frischluft, which gives a pretty great like a transition so that there's not blurry edges.
I'm
It's
covering
another
that as
plugin.
well.
I forget what the effect is called. I just know the
It's
category is
called depth of
Frischluft.
field.
It's called FL depth of field. There you go, Frischluft depth of field. And it's been used by a bunch of people who are doing Cinema 4D and After Effects workflows, and achieves a pretty realistic transition for your depth of field. So it's something that in some cases also handles some of the anti-aliasing problems pretty well.
I'll be talking
I've
about
also
that one
known,
too.
yeah, I've also known that I know that some people use some internal After Effects tools as well to try to soften the edge transition in order to not have any of that pixelation around the edges. With that said, I've had various results with the built-in camera lens blur, but wanted to show this example of what you could do to the camera lens blur inside of After Effects. And essentially, this camera lens blur, if we took a close look at it, is referencing the depth of field EXR file that I basically spat out of Cinema 4D, right? So I actually did a separate multi-pass render with the depth file and was able to use that. This is the one just for text. And if there were any issues in terms of ranges of out of focus fields that weren't turning up, you can even keyframe the blurriness values in certain cases if you wanted a less extreme amount at a certain point in time. I also just wanted to show Chad the background here too, because there's some interesting stuff going on for a few of these things. So I wanted to kind of dive into my pre-comp and show a couple things going on here. I created a solid white background, and on top of that, I've got my mountains pass here. The only reason this is pre-composed is because I spat out my alpha channel separately. So inside of here, there's a Luma matte going on, Luma track matte referencing the actual alpha channel. And then here, I'm actually applying the depth pass. Like you can see here, it's an EXR file, and I'll just show it to you in normal mode. Okay. So you can see the mountains was a separate pass. I applied this just with an overlay effect to for more of a look purpose to kind of get this black edges before I started to correct this and also have these mountains tailor off in the background. I brought down the opacity of this a little bit using that blend mode. There are certain people who will take that depth pass as well and use different blend modes in order to sort of mix it together. And then as a final step here, I added an actual universe gradient ramp to give it a colorized effect, combined with
Cool.
a camera lens blur, which is then also using the depth pass to have it go more blurry as you go further into the background. Right, and you can see a little bit of fringing going on here with the camera lens blur. It's kind of a great segue to show some of the stuff that you're doing, Chad.
Yeah, that sounds great. Let's see.
I got you. I think I got
Okay.
you there. Hold on. Do you have something
Oh,
flashing in front of your screen?
yes. Okay.
Awesome.
Looks like you all can see my screen. Is that working, Nick? Can you see this?
I can see this, yes.
Okay. So this is something I dug through the archives for today, and I have a few projects that are pretty interesting and pretty old. So this is like 7 years ago, but I was really pushing the limits of what I knew about Cinema 4D at the time, and I, knew how to render out a shallow depth of field with like camera blur, and it took days and days to render out just like the simple scene. And then when I did render it out, there were a bunch of issues. There was a bunch of like noise, and it just like wasn't good. And because it took so long to render out, it was just not very friendly for iterating or making changes or whatever. And then, when there was noise and issues with the render, and I had to like redo the whole thing, it was just like such a nightmare. So I opted to get this look by playing with depth passes, like what Nick was talking about. So here's the initial render, and it looks very cold and sterile, and it looks very CG. It's like it's too sharp. And so what I did is I took my a depth pass, which looks like this here. That's like the depth pass that I rendered out using the method that Nick talked about. So like
Cool.
I have been able to get this to work, the depth passes deal. And going back to the question before about the extreme depth of field, when you render this out and you have the lens blur being provided by Cinema 4D, it's like baked in. I mean, that blur is there, it's permanent. So like you better hope it's flawless and you don't want to change anything about it. The benefit of doing this in After Effects with a depth pass like this is that you have total control. You can change the depth of field and the focal plane if you want. You can change the focus to different areas of the image. You can change, like again, the focal plane, how deep the depth of field is. You could make the like a really shallow depth of field, so everything's super blurry, or whatever you want to do. It's completely flexible because, again, we're just taking this grayscale map, which is telling After Effects the depth plane. And then once we know the depth plane, we can do all kinds of fiddling after the fact. So I have here my raw render, and I'm just going to start from scratch from what Nick mentioned. I want to show you some solutions here and also some potential issues. So I'm going to solo this layer so we can see it, and I'm going to give you the good, bad, and the ugly. I'm going to give you like, I mean, it sounds like I'm going to give you, like, it's going to take a long time. It's not going to take a long time, but a lot of times when people do demos like this, we kind of skip over a lot of the potential gotchas, but like that's kind of what this series is about, is just, the gotchas and the problems that you run into. So there are a few solutions, and none of them are perfect. I don't think that there is a perfect solution to this. So what I'm going to do is I just applied the native camera lens blur effect, and then I want to go down to the blur map, and I want to choose my depth pass. And we can see that it does some pretty interesting stuff that's pretty good. I mean, the blur here with the native camera lens blur is actually like a really high quality blur. Like if we look at like what's going on here, it's a good quality blur. But as I crank this up, you'll start to see one of the big issues with this thing is that we have this texture that's like blurred out of existence. But then where we have edges in our depth pass, it's like After Effects doesn't quite know how to handle those edges. And so if this were a real blur, obviously these edges would not be razor sharp, but they are razor sharp. And so then we have to be really careful with how much we're blurring, because we can't give away that this hard edge still exists. And then when we have like a little bit later on here, there's an overlap where we have a depth plane overlapping a very different depth plane. And when that happens, it becomes even more obvious because we have something that should be in focus here and something that's out of focus here. And when they overlap, again, that tends to create a lot of issues. I'll talk about how to fix that in just a second. But one of the cool things here is the blur focal distance. And so we can do rack focus effects after the fact. So we can have the helmet be in focus, and then we can rack focus to, or we could other way around. We could have the helmet be in focus, and then the horn can be in focus. And that's, again, one of the magical things with these depth passes, that you have total flexibility after the fact. But we're seeing these kind of like weird things happening on the edges. And this isn't my biggest concern, because there are a million different ways to handle alpha channels and the edges and stuff like that. So we could fix that stuff. But the edges internally, this is where there are some problems. So camera lens blur is notorious for creating these kind of like wonky, ugly edges, but it's free. That's the benefit. It's free. It renders very slowly, but the blur that's here does look good. So and it does have options for bokeh and stuff like that. So if you want to create some gain for the highlights, it does create a really realistic look, as opposed to like Gaussian blur, which just kind of like blurs in a very unrealistic way, and not the way that cameras do. So there's a new effect out there now called fast bokeh, and it's a free effect. And you can use a depth layer as well. So I'll change this to like the depth pass. And then to see it, I'll increase the blur radius a little bit. This is a relatively new effect. And there's also a pro version, which gives you more features. I recommend the pro version. It's significantly better. But there is a free version, and the pro version is only $50. So it's pretty great. So I'm going to choose a use focus point, which is a pro feature, I believe, because it says pro right here. So that's my guess. And if I click on the little effect control point here, I could actually select the thing that I want to be in focus. So you can see, like, I could do a rack focus this easily and with this much control, where I could just like actually just like click and see what that is. So it's really great. And the fast bokeh, the reason why it's called fast bokeh is it renders extremely fast. Which I've never seen another like post render blur effect render this quickly. If I change the iris shape to like polygon HQ, we tend to get, it's a little bit slower, but we tend to get like an even better result. And again, we can animate the focus distance with this point here. There's also some other features here. We can invert the depth map, which sometimes can give us better results as well. And you can see how it's handling these edges. It's a much more organic effect than what we saw with camera lens blur. There are still some issues sometimes with Fast Bokeh Pro with the edges. I mean, handling edges is just a challenging thing to do. But it does handle well, and again, it's very inexpensive, and it's a new effect that's being updated all the time. So all these options to adjust like what the polygons of the bokeh look like, this is a new feature as of like the last couple months. So that's kind of like a cool benefit of Fast Bokeh Pro. The other thing that Nick mentioned here is the Frischluft depth of field plugin. And this is actually what I ended up using. Again, I did this project like 8 years ago. So this is actually the tool that I ended up using. I could change my depth layer here and increase the radius to get the blur. And the downside of this Frischluft depth of field thing is that it's pretty expensive. It's $200. I don't know that there's a demo. And probably the worst thing about it is that it hasn't been updated in a really long time. Like, I think last time it was updated, there was an episode of Parker Lewis Can't Lose talking about the dangers of Y2K. So it's scary for me investing like $200 into a plugin that hasn't been updated in a really long time, because then, you know, I don't know, it's kind of a tricky situation. But this plugin is really powerful, and it handles edges really well. And you can see like the rack focus here. And again, the blur on the edges is going to be probably the most realistic that you're going to be able to get. So this is the final version. I also use the Frischluft depth of field thing on the background, which is I made these candles in Cinema, and then I brought them into After Effects with these nulls or with nulls and where the lights are, and used particular, just spitting out a bunch of particles that die really quickly. And then I used the depth of field plugin to create some like bokeh and stuff like that. So they have like this kind of like flickering candlelight or whatever. So like as these like horns like overlap and stuff like that, like it looks fairly decent. And also, again, I could rack focus and change the focus after the fact. You have a lot of flexibility for handling that stuff when you do it in post. Let me show you one really quick trick. Yeah, do it.
I had a quick question from you from Rob, and he was just asking if Red Giant had a similar solution regarding camera blurs.
I don't believe that we do. I mean, I don't think that there's any tool out there that that does. I think these are the only three things that I'm aware of in After Effects that handle this type of thing in post. I'm sure there are others, but these are the three that I'm aware of, and I don't know that Red Giant has anything in their arsenal that does this. It'd be a cool thing to have, though, I think.
Yes. Yes, I don't. Same answer to Chad. I know that same answer as Chad. I know that Red Giant Universe has like a compound blur where you can reference kind of a layer to create your blur, but nothing as powerful as the camera lens blur and plugins that Chad is showing for this particular type of workflow, sent from a depth pass from Cinema 4D.
Yeah. Also mention that Fast Bokeh Pro is an AE script, and it's made by Robite, the maker of Plexus.
Yep.
So,
I actually put the links in for both of those in the questions area if anyone's looking for it. So I did the AE scripts, the Robite, but it was just the Fast Bokeh Pro, not the actual free version, and then linked out to Frischluft as well, so you guys can take a look at the Lens Care package plugin.
Thanks, man. I want to show like one little trick. This is like off the beaten path, kind of, but like since we're talking about render passes, I feel like a need. Again, we're going to be recording this, so you can go back through if I'm going too fast. This isn't really part of the itinerary of today, but this is something that drove me crazy when talking about render passes, and just a real lifesaver. So I'm just going to mention this really quickly. Typically, when we work with render passes, like we talked about last week, we have these different render passes for all these different things. And again, as we talked about last week, they're constantly coming out with new things to render out for render passes. And when we're talking about OpenEXR sequences or other image sequences, we're talking about a lot of images. This is a really short little few second segment here, but this is like 126 images for each one of these. So I have the RGB alpha pass, I have a depth pass, I have an illumination pass, I have the material luminance pass, object buffers, all these things. And each one of these has 126 separate images because they're all still image sequence files. And then it becomes like this really chaotic thing, not only in your After Effects scene, but also on your hard drive as well. And, you know, like Nick talked about last week, that you can make an AEC file that will gather all of these for you, but it still just kind of drives me crazy. And there's a really awesome feature of OpenEXR files that allow us to kind of bypass that. And I'm just, again, 2 seconds, I want to show you this really quick. If I go into my render settings and I go into the save area here, now, typically what we do is we do the multi-pass image and we do the regular image, and then we also spit out the compositing file. But if I disable the saving of the compositing project file, then I can enable multi-layer file inside my OpenEXR file. And then what it will do is it will take all of these passes and put it into one single sequence. And also, that means that I don't have to save the regular image, because when I do a multi-pass image with an OpenEXR file, it automatically saves out an RGB pass anyways, like a beauty pass. So I don't have to even worry about that. So I don't have to save a regular EXR file. I don't have to save a compositing project file. And then in After Effects, this is what we end up with. I go to this thing here. I just have one file. This is it, just one file. And then I'm going to apply an effect, a native After Effects effect called Extractor. And this allows me to pull out whatever information is in this EXR file. Now my colors changed a little bit because it changes the color space. So I need to go into my project settings, color, and then change the working space to sRGB and click OK. And well, let me delete this and then start over again. Add that effect again. I'm not really sure why that didn't fix things.
Did you in linear color space maybe?
Did I not do that?
Yeah, you didn't. You clicked on the
Sorry, yes.
sRGB, but then the linearize.
Linearize, thank you. Sorry, that's the whole point. There we go. So when I come here, thank you, Nick, for saving me. I appreciate that. Usually last time I did that, it was like enabled by default, so I'm not sure why. Anyways, so I go down to here in my layers here, and then in this drop down, I have all of this information. So even though this is just one image sequence on my hard drive, it's seeing all the different objects here. And by the way, on a Mac, for some reason, the extractor plugin looks differently. There's like a layers button that you push with a little pop-up, and it's kind of weird. I'm not sure why there's not parity there, but I can look at the depth pass, and I could look at the illumination or whatever, or go back to RGBA using the drop down here with the red set to red and green set to green and blue set to blue. But all that information, all these passes are baked into one single file, and that's really the benefit of using an OpenEXR file, is that they can contain so much of this data. And for me, this is just easier to work with. And then of course I can duplicate this, and on the duplicate, I can, make this the depth pass, and then I could duplicate it again and make this one the reflection pass or whatever. But all that information is stored in one image sequence, and I just I love working like that.
So cool.
Okay. Oh, sorry, Nick, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, so cool. It saves you not having to worry about, having 10 different EXR files on your system. You just have one to work with. You use Extractor, and it could be so much cleaner depending on the workflow. I love it.
Yeah, I mean, then you have to go in and name your layers. So it's you gotta do some housekeeping and stuff like that. But I still really prefer working that way. And then I don't have millions of passes that I need to just kind of keep there always in my comp. I can just use the passes as I need them, and that's a lifesaver. And Jonathan, I see the question. The Extractor plugin is like a native effect in After Effects. It's already there, so you don't have to install anything or buy anything or download or anything or whatever. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, as long as you're using the I think the latest couple of releases of Adobe After Effects, it should be included natively inside the application. I think it was. I don't know. Do you know how many years ago it was purchased?
It's been a while. I think it was.
It's been a while, right? Okay.
Pre CS6, I would say. I could be wrong, but it's been there for it's been there for a while.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm gonna switch gears a little bit. So we're talking about how to use After Effects to do post-render solutions, and one of those things is reflections. And I found this project that I did over 9 years ago, and it's the shot with this. Oops, sorry, I didn't realize there's any audio there. So this was made for the first generation iPad. So the resolution's 1024 by 768. So that's how old this is. Again, over 9 years. And I used RG reflection at the time to create this post render reflection. This is the behind the scenes of us shooting this on green screen. And then I could go in with this, the red giant reflection effect, which is super, super easy. Allowed me to kind of fade the reflection and get this really glassy effect. That's how long I've been using the reflection plugin by Red Giant. But there is a really strong limitation. There has been a really strong limitation of it, is if you wanted to have a reflection that integrated with the environment a little bit better, you kind of had to manually tweak it yourself, and that had a tendency to kind of mess things up a bit. Still a great tool. I use it, again, I've been using it over 9 years, but it's really got it's got a new upgrade that makes it so it completely changes everything. So one of the things that we can do here is I could apply reflection. And so if I click on this, you can see kind of what it does. It gives you kind of this axis here, and I can adjust the axis, and I could adjust like where the reflection's like pointing or what have you. And then it creates this kind of like cool organic. I'm not sure, like something happened where I have this like weird mountainy thing just kind of happened there. Okay, I'm gonna temporarily turn off this mat because that's not working right and you can't, it's hard to see. But basically this is like what it does. It gives you kind of like this axis for creating a horizon line, and then you can kind of like stretch out the reflection or make it like more shallow, and that's what you've been able to do with it for years. But I mean, as we're going over this water, that's a real big challenge because we want to make it look like his reflections integrating with the water. And this is, for me, one of the biggest problems as a compositor is, shadows and reflections integrating with the environment. Because, if we're creating like the CG environment and everything's all set up for us and nothing's going to change, then that's fine. But if I'm getting assets from the CG artist and then I don't know what I'm going to be compositing these assets into, this might change and it might have different ripples and whatever else like this. And so then there's not really a way in the CG tool to be able to create or anticipate what's going to come down the pipeline and create reflections for it. And so then, we have a whole bunch of challenges. We could fake it with, turbulent displace or whatever, but it would be better if there was a way to integrate the reflections into the environment. And the new version of reflection that just came out a few months back in VFX Suite 1.5 gives us that flexibility. So if I go to displacement, I can choose for the displacement map, this like plate. And so then it's going to take the distortion of this reflection from that plate, which is basically this layer. So as I increase horizontal displacement, I might need to increase contour detail as well. But yeah, you're starting to see here, let me take this down a little bit, but you're starting to see here that it's getting distorted, the reflection is getting distorted by the actual layer itself. So this is a dynamic thing that's responding to the environment. As I move in time, you could see that these waves are displacing the guy. So maybe I'll take down horizontal displacement like a little bit, and then I could also adjust the fall off, which is really cool. So if I want it to be so that the reflection closer to the object is really sharp, and then the reflection kind of like fades, I could increase the displacement fall off so that it's sharper right here, and then it just kind of picks up the ripples later down and the reflection. Again, I can increase or decrease the contour detail to see like how much it's being broken up. I can smooth this a little bit if I want to kind of soften things up a little bit. And then I'll add a matte at the end, which, gets rid of the dude on the boat. But then we have this much more realistic, believable reflection. Again, it's essentially procedural. It's built off of what's going on in the scene, which is incredible. And after taking a little bit more time, like this is the final result where we have, I'm not sure what's going on with this mat. It's like all messed up, and so that's messing with my thing. I was like looking at this project last night to make sure everything was cool, and this wasn't there, but I'll just take this off temporarily. But you can see like that this is responding to the water, the environment, which is really cool. So this old reflection tool that's been around for like a really long time that I've known and used and loved now has this amazing ability to use a layer, use its own layer, something you have in your scene as the displacement map for the reflection, which is, I don't know, it's a lifesaver, a real lifesaver. I love it.
And you didn't have to do anything special to that background layer, did you? Like it's literally just the background.
Yeah, I just used the
You didn't have to make
background
it black
plate.
and white or anything like that, or do a special displacement map for it. That's so cool.
Yeah, I mean, like that's really, I mean, that's the magic of the solution, is that it uses whatever you have going on. You don't have to like kind of, what I would do before is I would use like turbulent displace and like try to kind of approximate what was going on. But then because it's not procedural dynamic at all, then I had to go back if the background changed, or we did a slip edit, we use a different part of the frame or something like that, I'd have to go redo it again so it kind of basically matched. And this way you don't have to do anything. Like if I did a slip edit here, it would just use a different part of the frame and it would be perfect. So, and you don't, yeah, like you said, there's no setup, it just uses what's there. It's fantastic.
Awesome.
Oh, do I surrender back to you, Nick? How do I do that?
You can totally surrender back to me. Actually, hold on. Let me just hijack you. Hold on. I think, wait, hold on one
Okay,
sec.
wait.
I almost made some random guy named Mike the presenter. So just ignore that, Mike. Apologies
Okay.
to put you on the spot.
I
Okay,
just sent it
so
back to you, Nick.
awesome. I'm showing my screen. This is great. Yes, I'm going to kind of lead. I just wanted to show one more thing about the reflections here. There's actually several going on, which is kind of cool. In this specific project, there's a ton of models that are being referenced right now by Element 3D, but then you could see the multiple uses of reflection here in the water. I wanted to point out just one of these, which is the actual sun. And the sun was done with No Light Factory. This is also included in VFX Suite, and we really haven't. Have we covered this yet, Chad? Like besides like just touching upon it briefly, or?
Yeah, I think like the first couple of weeks, in those first couple of weeks somewhere, we mentioned it somehow, like briefly, I think.
Okay, so this is a pretty robust lens flare designer. So sometimes if you have Universe, you should know a few things. There's a No Light Factory Easy, and that has a few awesome things. So it has a collection of presets, not as many as No Light Factory. It has a few automation features in terms of you being able to identify a location layer and then also hide where your lens flare is in the scene. But No Light Factory has, number one, more presets. I should also mention there's a section here called behaviors, which allows you to automatically animate your lens flare using blink, flicker, pulse, or strobe. And one of my favorites is the designer. So if you need to design a lens flare from scratch, this is where you can go. There are a series of presets over here at the side, even more than there are in No Light Factory Easy. I think there's 4 categories in No Light Factory Easy, and there's, my counting is off today, Chad, 9 here. The only other thing I wanted to mention in the latest, well, in the first release of the new VFX Suite, under this section here on the right-hand side is an element section where you can basically work with pre-built elements of a lens and you can add them to your scene. So rather than having to, let's say, build one of these items from scratch, such as a disc or a glow ball, which you can start with one of these pre-built. And inside this category is one of my favorites. I hope I don't miss this category, but wanted to mention it. It's adding lens dirt. And there is a dirt plugin from this extensive list of elements that you could add and even reference specific types of textures. Have you seen this? Oh, here it is. It's called the lens texture effect. I'll just double click this and wanted to show the previews aren't loading correct on my iMac Pro here, but you have all of these textures that you can add, such as like frozen, totally inappropriate for our sun. But you can bring up the brightness as well as the density, and then you have this cool lens texture over your lens flare inside the designer that you can utilize, and I just love it.
That's awesome. I didn't know that.
Yeah, so it actually shows up here. You can see uh, the texture that I added, right? You can see that right there. And I just wanted to mention that this is included in the VFX Suite as well, and some of the differences between that and No Light Factory Easy, because there is that No Light Factory inside of the Universe set of plugins. Now, in this particular example, and Chad, you showed this too, but one of the new features of the VFX Suite 1.5 is the fact that with reflection, you add reflection to a layer, right? So I actually added it to this No Light Factory layer, but by clicking this button, it only shows the reflection only, which is one of the new features here, rather than you having to figure out to have the reflection by itself. And then mixed with a little bit of displacement and some color correction, this was then implemented into the scene. Now, just to also mention, just like reflection, there is a shadow effect, and the shadow effect also includes a displacement and works in a very similar fashion, wouldn't you say, Chad? So it's
Yeah,
like
yeah,
when
yeah,
you
very
add
similar.
when you add the shadow, if I select it here by its name in effect controls, you see that T-bar and how it was manipulated to have the shadow go off over here to the left. You've then got some controls for fading your shadow off into the distance. And I think one of my favorites again, which is using displacement. And I'll just show none here so you can see sort of the original shadow, but just adding or identifying your plate and then kind of increasing the horizontal displacement here. Do you guys see what just happened? It's like, it feels like it's part of the ground and there's no need to play it with anything else. And if you're always curious of how shadow is reading your displacement, if I click on this badge right here, it will actually show the displacement map that VFX sees.
Also, I worked for a company a while back where we were doing print stuff with After Effects, and we were using displacement maps. And displacement map is like one of those things that's like super annoying. That's like one of the only reasons why you bring things in at document size instead of layer size. And everything has to be like so meticulous when you set it up. And then there's like pre-comping stuff that usually has to happen. And there's so many chances for it to go wrong. So like, I mean, that's another great benefit of this. You don't have to worry about that. You don't have to worry about setting up your own displacement map with all of the potential issues that could arise there, which is also great.
Yeah, it just kind of handles it for you, which is so awesome.
Yeah.
I wanted to show one more thing about the shadow effect. You can see that there's quite a few parameters that you can play with, and a lot of them mimic the things that you'll see in reflection. But I love this option here, which is called shadow bend, which adds another point to your T-bar. And while this isn't a typical example where you might want to add a shadow bend, you now have a extra point here where you could bend your shadow and how it looks depending on the light source that's in your scene.
Oh, that's awesome. I don't think I've seen that.
Yeah, it's like, it's so cool. Is you got this third shadow point, and then depending on what your background is and what your composition layers are, you could always go to these access colors, by the way, and then change them to something else which is more visible inside your comp, which is kind of cool too. I think something also that's really cool about the comps that we've showed, Chad, is that these workflows are also utilizing supercomp, right? So you are adding shadow at an earlier stage, like onto your layer and mixing it with the background. But then for some final compositing, you then send it to supercomp to add some light wrap, to add a little bit of grain for a bit of a filmic quality, and using the entire suite for your final compositions. And it was the same, I believe, from the example you showed too, with reflection, right, Chad?
Yeah, yeah. It went through super comp in the final pass of it. Yeah.
Yeah, so that kind of brings us to the end of a little demo. So covered quite
And
a lot of information
a little
in
teaser for
just,
next week as you talk about super comp too. So that's good.
I know, I kind of set it up that way.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Yeah, so that brings us to the end. We looked at some depth passes, we've looked at reflection, and Chad, I just absolutely loved that example you showed from how many years ago, and seeing that square video format again
Thank
inside
you.
of
Yeah.
composition. That was
Over
pretty cool.
9 years ago. Over
9 years
9 years
ago.
ago.
NTSC. My gosh. Just time passes. Just for anyone who tuned in late, I just want to go back to Safari here for a second. You should note, here we go, if I bring up my Maxon volume training YouTube page, within a few hours on the Maxon volume program training page, you'll be able to watch this webinar again. So simply head here and we'll be back here next Monday, both Chad and I, to cover our final week in VFX Suite, and as Chad just mentioned, going over SuperComp.
Yeah, it's gonna be awesome.
Awesome. We have a couple more minutes. Any questions, or Chad, did you have any thoughts before we take off?
I don't have any so far. I'm excited about the super comping next week. It's always a fun thing to do.
Yes, we got a little bit of SuperComp and finalizing our journey in VFX Suite, which will be great.
Sweet.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Thank you so
Ken.
much, Ken. And we'll see you next week as well. And I wanted to a sincere thank you to everyone who joined again this week. We can't thank you enough, and we'll see you next week at 12 Eastern, 9 Pacific for our final week in VFX Suite. Have a great
Awesome.
week, everybody.
See you, buddy.
Take care. Bye, everybody.